Usually when we talk about like really monumental human achievements, there's this expectation of visible, tangible engineering.
Right, the stuff you can actually see and point to.
Exactly. Like you look at the Saturn V rocket sitting on a launch pad, or the massive underground rings at the Large Hadron Collider, and the sheer physical complexity just kind of stares back at you.
Oh, totally. It's undeniable. You see the thousands of components, the fuel lines, the, miles of wiring. It all just screams of this conscious, sweat-inducing design.
Yeah, we build these enormous monuments to our own intelligence because, well, I think we tend to equate physical size with computational complexity.
That's a great point. We point to the rocket and basically say, hey, look at what our brains built.
But then you pivot and you actually look at the brain itself. You step into the world of human cognition and suddenly that visible metallic blueprint just vanishes.
Yeah, you're just looking at a quiet biological landscape. It's just a mass of wet tissue in the dark, really.
Right. And yet it's performing these computational feats that are so staggering, so like infinitesimally precise, that they make our most advanced artificial neural networks look like pocket calculators.
Which is such a wild reality to consider.
And here is the craziest part, to me at least. The most complex engineering marvel on the planet isn't happening in some server farm in Silicon Valley. It's happening inside the head of an average 3-year-old child.
That is the ultimate paradox, isn't it? The whole biological evolution versus artificial intelligence thing.
Yeah, because we have supercomputers that can calculate the trajectory of a probe to Pluto down to the millimeter. But those exact same machines absolutely struggle to hold a dynamic, flowing conversation.
Siri and Alexa still sound robotic. They don't really understand context the way a toddler does.
Exactly. So right now, I just want you, the listener, to consider the voice you are hearing. Just focus on the actual mechanics to this exact moment.
It's quite a lot of physics happening all at once.
It really is. As I speak, my vocal cords are vibrating. They are pushing these acoustic pressure waves out through the air of the room you're in.
Completely invisible waves of compressed air.
Right, and they're hitting your eardrum, vibrating 3 tiny bones in your inner ear, sending fluid waves over microscopic hair cells, and firing electrical impulses directly into your cortex.
And the wild thing is, you're not consciously trying to do any of this.
No effort at all. Without a drop of effort, your brain is instantly transforming those physical vibrations into abstract, complex meaning. And it happens in milliseconds.
You don't even notice the decoding process, because honestly, the effortlessness is an illusion.
A completely necessary illusion, right? Absolutely.
If you were consciously aware of the millions of calculations required just to understand the end of this sentence, you'd be completely paralyzed by the cognitive load.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking you on a really comprehensive, advanced journey into the neural underpinnings of arguably our greatest skill.
Human language.
Exactly. We are diving deep into the dense, fascinating material from Chapter 55 of the 6th edition of Principles of Neuroscience.
This is essentially going to function as an advanced neuroscience exploration. We have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. We're going to map out the hidden structural architecture of language, the mechanics of how children acquire that architecture, the cutting-edge dual-stream network running in your adult brain, and how clinical neurology proves all of this exists.
And to really appreciate that machinery, we first have to respect the sheer density of the raw data.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I brought up the AI paradox a moment ago. What actually makes human spoken language so vastly different, so much harder for a machine to process than, say, a written textbook?
Well, it lives in the fundamental physics of spoken versus written communication. Think about a printed page for a second.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
When you look at a textbook, the words are neatly bracketed by blank white spaces. There is a definitive, unmistakable visual boundary.
Right, telling your eye exactly where one discrete unit of meaning ends and the next one begins.
Exactly. Or telling a machine's optical character recognition software the same thing. The blank spaces basically do half the work of parsing the information for you.
So the visual data is already pre-segmented. You don't have to guess where the word "the" stops and the word "apple" begins.
But in natural, conversational, spoken language, those spaces simply do not exist.
Wait, really? We don't pause between words?
We really don't. If you look at a spectrographic analysis of speech, which is basically a visual graph of the sound waves we produce, There are no reliable acoustic breaks or silences between words.
That is so counterintuitive.
I know it is. In fact, sometimes the acoustic transition between the end of one word and the beginning of the next is actually smoother and tighter than the transition between two syllables within a single word.
Wow. So natural speech is just a continuous, rapid, unbroken flow of acoustic energy.
Yes, it's a waterfall of sound.
So the brain is essentially catching this waterfall of sound and having to chop it up into individual cups of water on the fly, without any gaps in the flow to guide it.
Exactly, which means the brain must be making decisions based on tiny, distinct acoustic features hidden inside that waterfall.
And I guess that introduces our fundamental building blocks here, right? Phonemes and phonetic units.
Yes, and we really need to draw a hard line between those two terms because the distinction is vital.
Okay, lay it out for us. What's the difference?
Well, the defining feature of human language, the thing that separates it from all other animal communication, is that we use a finite set of distinctive speech sounds that can be mathematically combined into infinite possibilities.
Right, like a bird has a set number of calls for a set number of meanings.
Exactly. But we have a few dozen sounds that can describe the entire universe. Those categories of meaning-changing sounds are called phones.
Meaning changing being the operative phrase there, right?
Yes, a phone is a mental category. It's a sound that, if you swap it out for another sound, the actual dictionary meaning of the word changes in your specific language.
Okay, so that's a phoneme. What about a phonetic unit?
Beneath the phoneme is the phonetic unit. These are subphonemic. They're just the raw, physical, acoustic sounds we are biologically capable of making with our mouths.
Regardless of whether they actually change a word's meaning or not.
Exactly. It's all about the rules a specific culture applies to that raw acoustic biology. The source material highlights a classic comparison between English and Japanese to illustrate this.
Yeah, using the R and L sounds, right?
Yes. So in the English language, the R sound and the L sound belong to two completely separate phonemic categories. The brain treats them as distinct boundaries.
Because if you take the word rock and you swap the R for an L, you get the word lock.
Right. The physical object you're describing changes from a stone to a piece of security hardware. Because the meaning changes entirely, English speakers must maintain a strict neural boundary between those two acoustic signals.
But the Japanese brain maps that exact same acoustic territory completely differently, doesn't it?
It does. In Japanese, the sound change between R and L does not distinguish words. The linguistic rules dictate that these sounds are allophones.
Meaning they belong to the exact same phonemic category.
Right. A Japanese speaker might produce something closer to an R or closer to an L depending on the surrounding vowels, but to the Japanese listener's brain, it is the exact same unit of meaning.
So they are both phonetic units, mere physical variations, but they are not distinct phones. I find it so fascinating that this isn't just a quirk of translation, it literally alters how you perceive sound.
It absolutely does, and the inverse happens to English speakers too. Take the Spanish language, for example.
Okay, what happens in Spanish?
A Spanish speaker's brain makes a massive critical distinction between the P sound in pano and the B sound in bano. To them, those are entirely different universes of sound.
And what's the physical difference between those two sounds?
It's based on something called voice onset time. That's the microscopic delay between when you release the air from your lips and when your vocal cords actually start vibrating.
And Spanish has a different voice onset boundary for those sounds than English does.
Yes, exactly. So when an English speaker hears a native Spanish speaker say those words, the English brain often treats that specific P and B as essentially the same sound category.
We're basically acoustically blind to the boundary that is blaringly obvious to the Spanish speaker.
Right. Our brains are actively grouping identical physical signals differently based on the geographic region where we happen to spend our toddler years.
Which brings us to the mechanics of the sound itself. If these phonetic units are so tiny, how does the auditory system physically detect these boundaries?
The answer lies in formant frequencies. You have to think of the vocal tract, your throat, tongue, lips, and nasal cavity as this dynamic biological filter.
Okay, like an instrument.
Exactly like an instrument. When your vocal cords vibrate, they create a rich, buzzy sound with many overlapping frequencies. As you move your tongue and lips, you change the shape of that fleshy, resonant chamber.
Like moving your fingers over the holes of a flute. You are physically sculpting the sound waves before they leave your mouth.
Precisely shaping them. Certain frequencies are amplified and others are dampened by the shape of your mouth. These peaks of amplified acoustic energy are called formants.
And the brain's auditory cortex is just ruthlessly tracking the specific frequencies where these formants peak.
Yes. So if you say pat and then you say bat, the difference between those two words, that single phonetic unit, is just a shift in the patterns and timing of those amplified formant frequencies.
And in the context of normal, flowing conversational speech, these structural shifts in the acoustics occur incredibly fast, right?
Unbelievably fast. We are talking on the order of tens of milliseconds. A typical conversation spits out anywhere from 10 to 15 phonemes every single second.
That is just a staggering computational load for the listener. Your ear is tracking microfluctuations in air pressure every few milliseconds, and your brain is categorizing them on the fly.
And it gets even more complicated because you don't just throw all these sounds into a blender. Languages have strict architectures for how sounds can bond together.
I always like to think of it as a genetic code. A specific language has a genetic code that dictates not just the inventory of available sounds, but the molecular rules of how those sounds are legally allowed to combine.
That's a great analogy. Linguists call these phonotactic rules. They act as the structural glue of the language, specifying the legal and illegal combinations of phonemes.
Right, like the difference between English and Polish. Both languages utilize the individual phones, Z and B, but their genetic codes have completely different bonding rules.
Exactly. If you try to start an English word with the sound combination ZB, the English brain rejects it. It feels physically wrong in the mouth and sounds completely alien to the ear.
Because the English phonotactic rulebook says the Z sound and the B sound cannot bond at the onset of a syllable.
But in Polish, that exact same combination is a perfectly legal, structurally sound molecular bond. You see it in very common names like Zbigniew.
The brain of a Polish speaker processes the ZB onset effortlessly because their neural network has been wired to expect that exact statistical combination.
Right. So we have the raw physical sounds, the phonetic units. We categorize them into meaning-changing phones. We bond them together using phonotactic rules.
And once we do that, we arrive at the next structural level up, the morpheme.
Oh.
Which is where abstract meaning actually begins to take shape.
Exactly. A phone is merely a sound, like the K sound doesn't mean anything on its own, but a morpheme carries actual semantic weight. It is the smallest structural unit of meaning or grammatical function in a language.
They're basically the Lego bricks of vocabulary.
Yes. A whole word can be a single morpheme, like the word bug, but you can attach other morphemes to it to alter its reality.
Prefixes and suffixes being the classic examples there.
Right. If you take the adjective important, you have established a baseline meaning. If you snap on the prefix un, you have completely reversed the polarity of the word to unimportant.
That tiny un is a bound morpheme.
Or taking your earlier word bug, you add the s suffix to make it bugs. You have just signaled a shift from singular to plural using a single sound, changing the listener's mental image from one insect to a swarm.
But, the brain's storage system for this isn't perfectly clean, because we have the absolute headache of irregular verbs that completely ignore the standard morpheme rules.
Ugh, the irregulars. But they reveal a lot about how memory works in language. The standard rule for past tense in English is to add the ed morpheme. You walk, you walked, you jump, you jumped.
Right, but a child cannot apply that rule to the verb to go. They say goed, and they are immediately corrected to went. They say braked, and must learn broke.
Which means the brain can't just rely on a procedural rule-generating algorithm. It has to maintain a massive brute force associative memory bank just for the exceptions.
It requires an entirely parallel neural mechanism, doesn't it?
It does. The regular verbs are processed by a rule-based grammatical system, which is heavily reliant on the frontal lobe. Meanwhile, the irregular verbs have to be memorized as individual vocabulary items, relying more heavily on the temporal lobe's declarative memory systems.
And finally, capping off this whole multi-layered architecture, we reach the highest structural level, syntax.
Ah, syntax. This is the master rule book.
It dictates how we string all these assembled words and phrases together to construct complex relational thoughts.
Exactly. Syntax is the architecture of the sentence. It determines who is doing what to whom. If you just have the words dog, bites, and man, the vocabulary is there, but the event is unknown.
Right, until you put them in order.
Syntax provides that order. In English, the syntax strongly demands a subject-verb-object progression. The dog bites the man. The actor, the action, the receiver.
But that order is not a universal law of human thought.
Not at all. If you look at Japanese syntax, the architecture is fundamentally rearranged to subject-object-verb. The sentence, "Kore wa kiki o tabemasu," translates structurally to he cake eats.
The verb, the action anchors the end of the thought rather than the middle.
Yes, and it filters down into the smaller phrases too. In English, the descriptive adjective almost always precedes the noun. We say a very intelligent man. You build the traits before you reveal the subject.
But in French syntax, the noun is established first, followed by the descriptors. Un homme très intelligent. A man very intelligent.
And that forces the brain to buffer and hold information in working memory differently depending on the language you speak. If the verb comes at the end, you have to hold the subject and the object in your active memory longer before you know how they interact.
Okay, so we've mapped out the sheer, terrifying complexity of the system. We have milliseconds of shifting formants, categorized into phonemes, bonded by phonotactics, built into morphemes, and strung together by syntax.
It is overwhelmingly complex, even for an adult neuroscientist to map out.
Exactly. So how does a newborn baby, a biological entity that cannot even hold up its own head, crack this code?
It's incredible, and this leads us to the universal pattern of language acquisition and, frankly, some of the most profound behavioral science of the 20th century.
To truly grasp the magnitude of how we currently understand infant learning, we have to contextualize it against the massive intellectual war that dominated linguistics and psychology for the last half of the 20th century.
Right, this wasn't a minor academic disagreement. It was a fundamental clash over the nature of the human mind itself. The debate was anchored by two opposing titans: the strong learning theorists, led by the behaviorists, and the strong nativists.
Let's set the stage in 1957. B.F. Skinner publishes his seminal book, Verbal Behavior. Skinner is the heavyweight champion of behaviorism.
His entire philosophy is built on operant conditioning, the idea that you can shape any behavior through a strict schedule of rewards and punishments.
Because he had achieved immense success, demonstrating that you could teach animals highly complex tasks through external reinforcement.
Exactly. You put a rat in a box, it randomly bumps a lever, a food pellet drops out. The rat associates the lever with the reward, and soon it is pressing the lever intentionally.
And Skinner argued that human language, despite its poetry and complexity, was essentially no different. It was merely a learned behavior, acquired through environmental shaping.
So his model was that a baby just babbles random noises. Eventually, the baby accidentally produces a sound resembling mama. The mother immediately smiles, cheers, and gives the baby attention or a cookie.
The reward reinforces the behavior, and through thousands of these tiny managed reward contingencies, the parents sculpt the child's random babbling into perfect English grammar.
Skinner viewed the child's brain as a blank slate, a passive receptacle waiting to be molded entirely by external parental reinforcement. But this theory faced a monumental backlash.
Spearheaded by a young linguist named Noam Chomsky. Chomsky wrote this scathing, legendary review of Skinner's book, basically dismantling the behaviorist approach to language.
Because Chomsky pointed out a massive flaw in the logic of parental reinforcement, parents don't actually correct grammar in toddlers, they correct truth value.
Oh, right. If a toddler points to a dog and says, "Doggy, go outside," the parent doesn't withhold affection and say, "No, the dog went outside."
Exactly. The parent says, yes, the doggy went outside, the communication was successful, the grammar was wrong, but the reinforcement was positive.
So Chomsky introduced the concept of the poverty of the stimulus, didn't he?
He did. He argued that the linguistic data children receive from their environment is messy, fragmented, full of false starts and grammatical errors, and totally devoid of formal instruction.
There is simply not enough clean, reinforced data in a toddler's environment for them to deduce the immensely complex rules of syntax from scratch.
So Chomsky swung the pendulum to the absolute opposite extreme. He proposed the nativist view. He argued that humans are born with a highly specialized, genetically hardwired language faculty already embedded in the brain.
He proposed a universal grammar and a universal phonetics.
Yeah.
The child doesn't learn the rules. They're born knowing all possible rules.
Right. Mere exposure to the parents speaking English or Japanese acts merely as a trigger, flipping innate biological switches to select the correct pre-existing software.
So we have the rat-pressing behaviorist on one side and the hardwired, pre-programmed nativist on the other. Who actually won?
The modern behavioral and functional brain studies of the past few decades have delivered a fascinating verdict. They were both fundamentally wrong.
Wow.
Yeah. Language acquisition does not remotely resemble Skinner's external reward shaping. But Chomsky's idea of simply triggering a pre-packaged genetic option vastly underestimates the dynamic, computational heavy lifting the infant brain is actually doing.
So what's the modern view?
The modern view reveals that infant learning is an implicit, highly mathematical, and profoundly social process.
Let's look at the timeline of this process because the speed is what makes it seem so miraculous. By 12 months, an infant understands about 50 words, and their babbling has taken on the specific acoustic cadence of their native language.
And by age 3, they have a working vocabulary of roughly 1,000 words. They are creating novel, multi-word sentences and engaging in true conversation.
The absolute intricacies of formal grammar take longer, crystallizing around age 7 to 10, but the core machinery is up and running in a toddler.
And the foundation of that machinery is built in the very first months of life. The foundational mechanism was actually uncovered in a landmark 1971 study by psychologist Peter Imus.
He was investigating a phenomenon called categorical perception.
Yes. Imus wanted to know how we categorize speech sounds, so he set up a brilliant auditory experiment.
This is the study that completely shifted our understanding of auditory boundaries. Walk us through how he tested this, because you can't exactly ask a baby what they hear.
Well, Imus synthesized speech sounds using a computer, allowing him to control the acoustics with mathematical precision. He created a continuous acoustic gradient, essentially a dial, that slowly morphed the syllable ba into the syllable pa in small, equal acoustic steps.
So step 1 is pure ba, step 10 is pure pa, and the steps in between are tiny mathematical acoustic shifts. And the only physical difference was that tiny shift in voice onset time we discussed earlier.
Exactly. When he played the sequence for human adults, the adults did not hear a smooth, gradual transition. Their auditory system forced a rigid categorization.
Meaning, for the first several acoustic steps, the adults heard identical, unmodified Bayer sounds. They were completely deaf to the mathematical acoustic changes happening within that category.
But at a very specific point on the dial, the phonetic boundary, their perceptions snapped. Suddenly, the next tiny acoustic step sounded definitively like pa.
So the brain is actively filtering the continuous physical reality into discrete categorical buckets. It ignores the noise inside the bucket and only pays attention when the signal crosses the boundary.
Right. But adults only have these boundaries established for their native language. The real revelation was what Imus found when he tested infants.
And to test infants who cannot speak, he used a habituation paradigm based on their sucking rate on a specialized pacifier, correct?
Yes. Babies will suck faster when they hear a novel, interesting sound and slow down when they get bored of a repeating sound. Imus found that if he played an infant 2 different acoustic sounds from within the same phonetic category, say 2 slightly different versions of bay, the infant's sucking rate stayed low.
They were bored. They heard them as the exact same sound. But if the 2 sounds straddled that invisible phonetic boundary,
the sucking rate spiked. The infant's brain detected the shift. And here is the earth-shattering part. Imus and subsequent researchers demonstrated that infants could detect these slight acoustic changes at the boundaries for phonetic units in all the world's languages.
wait, all of them, like Hindi boundaries, Salish Native American boundaries, Japanese boundaries.
Yes, languages the infant had absolutely zero exposure to.
Which means, at birth, infants are linguistic universalists. They're born with an auditory system broadly tuned to hear every possible meaningful distinction in human speech.
They are biologically prepared to be dropped into any geographic region on the planet and master the local code.
But that universalist superpower is transient, isn't it? The brain can't maintain infinite possibilities forever. It must specialize to become efficient.
Exactly. This leads to the use it or lose it window of neural pruning, which dramatically narrows right before the baby produces their first actual words.
And the timeline of this pruning is incredibly tight. At 6 months of age, infants are still universalists. They effortlessly discriminate all phonetic units from all languages. But by the end of their first year, between 10 and 12 months, the window slams shut.
They actually lose the ability to discriminate phonetic changes in foreign languages that they were perfectly capable of hearing just a few months prior.
While simultaneously their sensitivity to the phonetic boundaries of their native language drastically sharpens.
There's a famous cross-cultural study that compared American and Japanese infants listening to the English R and L sounds. At 6 to 8 months, both the American and Japanese infants performed similarly well at distinguishing the sounds.
But test them again at 10 to 12 months.
The American infant's ability to hear the distinctions skyrockets, while the Japanese infant's ability plummets to near zero.
Their brain has literally rewired its auditory filters based on the environmental data. It's a critical sensitive period for phonetic learning.
And the question then becomes, how is the brain calculating which boundaries to keep and which to discard? It's not Skinner's cookie rewards, and it's not Chomsky's pre-programmed switch.
Right, the modern answer relies on two mechanisms: statistical learning and social gating. Let's explore this statistical engine first because it sounds like science fiction until you see the data.
Psychologist Jenny Safran published a beautiful demonstration of this. She proposed that babies are not passively listening, they're acting like tiny, brilliant subconscious statisticians, constantly calculating the transitional probabilities of the syllables they hear.
I love this study. This is the pseudo-word experiment. Explain the math the babies are doing here because they are essentially code-breaking a continuous stream of noise.
Well, Safran wanted to know how a baby finds word boundaries when there are no acoustic spaces between spoken words. So she synthesized a continuous stream of artificial invented words, pseudo-words like tibudo, pabiku, galatu, and daropi.
And she recorded a computer voice speaking these words in a completely randomized order for a solid 2 minutes. But the key is the delivery, right? It wasn't tibudo pabiku.
No, it was a flat, unbroken wall of sound. Tibudo pabiku galatu darpori. No pauses, no pitch changes, no stress, zero acoustic cues.
So the only way to figure out where one word ended and another began was to calculate the statistical likelihood that one specific syllable would follow another. Let's break down the math on that.
Sure. Because the syllables ti, bu, and du are always bonded together to form the single word tibudo, the transitional probability between ti and bu is 1.0. It is 100%. If you hear ti, you are mathematically guaranteed to hear bu next.
It's an internal sequence. But what about the boundary between two different words?
That's where the probability drops. What is the statistical chance of the syllable du being followed by the syllable pa? Well, du is the end of the word tibudo, and pa is the beginning of the word pabiku.
And because the words were played in a randomized order, du is followed by pa only a fraction of the time. The transitional probability is very low.
Exactly. So the baby's brain is listening to this unbroken drone and tracking the frequency of these pairings. High probability means this is a word. Low probability means this is the space between two words.
And when Safran tested the infants afterward using a looking time preference test, the 8-month-old babies stared longer at speakers playing the original pseudo-words, like tibudo.
They recognized them as cohesive units, but they showed significantly less recognition for part words, new combinations created by splicing the last syllable of one word with the first two of another, like tudaro.
They successfully extracted the hidden vocabulary purely by crunching the statistical distribution of the syllables, which leads to a very obvious billion-dollar question.
Let me guess. If the infant brain is just an incredibly powerful data mining machine, why can't we just sit a 9-month-old baby in front of a television playing high-definition Spanish cartoons and let their brain compile the statistics and learn a second language effortlessly?
Exactly. Why doesn't that work?
That exact proposition was tested in another landmark study by Patricia Kuhl, and it revealed the critical limitation of the statistical engine. Kuhl took 9 to 10-month-old American infants right in the middle of that sensitive pruning window and exposed them to Mandarin Chinese in a laboratory setting.
Over 12 25-minute sessions, right? And she divided them up into different exposure modalities to test the TV theory.
She did. The first group of American infants sat in the room and interacted with a live, human, native Mandarin speaker who read them books and played with toys while speaking Mandarin. A second group received the exact same auditory and visual material fed to them through a high-definition television screen.
And a third group received audio tape only. And a control group only heard English. Now, the auditory statistics were identical for the live group and the TV group. The raw data was exactly the same. What happened to their brains?
The divergence in the results was astounding. The American infants who interacted with the live human being learned the Mandarin phonetic units beautifully. Their neural ability to discriminate the Mandarin sounds was statistically indistinguishable from infants raised natively in Taiwan for 10 months.
Wow. They absorbed the new language seamlessly. But what about the babies watching the screen?
The infants exposed via television or audio tape learned absolutely nothing. Their ability to hear the Mandarin phonemes was completely flat, identical to the control group who had only heard English.
So the brain was presented with perfect statistical data on a glowing screen, and it simply refused to process it, which proves that the infant brain is not a passive data recorder. It has a gatekeeper, and that gatekeeper requires a social context. Why does the brain discard the TV data?
Because language evolved as an interpersonal mechanism. Further eye-tracking studies have illuminated the social gating hypothesis. It shows that successful learning correlates highly with the infant's ability to engage in joint attention.
Meaning the infant watches the tutor's eyes. They follow the gaze of the adult to see what the adult is looking at when they say a new word.
Yes. The social interaction, the shared gaze, the emotional connection, these are the biological keys required to unlock the statistical engine in the cortex. If the social key isn't turned, the raw acoustic data is treated as meaningless background noise.
It's a beautiful defense mechanism against processing irrelevant environmental sounds. And, this processing doesn't magically switch on at birth. The text highlights that the auditory system is actually bootstrapping this data collection while the baby is still in the womb.
Oh, the prenatal learning environment is surprisingly robust. It's governed entirely by prosody. In utero, the fetus is suspended in amniotic fluid. External sounds must pass through the mother's abdominal wall and the fluid, which acts as a low-pass physical filter.
So the high-frequency, crisp acoustic features that define individual consonants, the phonetic units, are heavily muffled or entirely lost. They aren't hearing the crisp P and B boundaries.
No, they aren't. But the low-frequency acoustic energy primarily sounds below 300 hertz, up to about 1,000 hertz, transmits beautifully through bone conduction. This low-frequency energy carries the prosody of the language.
Prosody being the underlying melody, the rhythm, the stress patterns, the intonation contour, the rise and fall of the mother's voice. They are hearing the music of the language, even if they can't hear the lyrics.
And that music leaves a profound neural imprint. Immediately at birth, newborns can be tested using that same pacifier-sucking paradigm. They demonstrate a clear statistical preference for the language their mother spoke during pregnancy over a foreign language.
They prefer the acoustic signature of their own mother's voice over another female's voice, too. And there's that incredible detail about reading stories.
Yes, if a mother reads a specific story aloud regularly during the final 10 weeks of pregnancy, the newborn will show a preference for the specific tempo, rhythm, and acoustic envelope of that specific story after birth, even if it is read by a stranger.
The fetal brain is already mapping the temporal structure of its auditory environment. So the auditory system is active early, but once the baby is born and opens its eyes, the visual system aggressively joins the language decoding process.
Right. It's highly multisensory.
We all have that intuitive sense that it is easier to understand someone in a loud, crowded restaurant if we can see their mouth moving. But the source discusses a laboratory phenomenon that proves speech perception is a multisensory illusion.
You are referring to the McGraw effect, which is one of the most compelling demonstrations in all of cognitive science. It proves that what we hear is not strictly a product of the ear.
Walk us through the setup of the McGraw paradigm.
In the McGraw paradigm, a subject is placed in front of a screen. The video shows a person's face clearly mouthing the syllable ga ga ga, so the visual data is definitively ga.
But the audio track synced to the video has been manipulated. The acoustic signal playing through the speakers is actually the syllable ba ba ba.
Right. So the eyes see ga, but the ears are hit with the pressure waves for ba. Two conflicting streams of data. How does the brain resolve the paradox?
It's amazing. Instead of choosing one over the other, the brain actively fuses the conflicting auditory and visual information and manufactures a completely new intermediate perception.
The subject will consciously report hearing the syllable da. And the crazy part is, even when you know the illusion is happening, even when you know the speaker's playing ba, if your eyes are open, your brain forces you to hear da.
It just highlights that the brain is a prediction machine, grabbing every available piece of sensory data site, sound, social context to build the linguistic map. Which brings us to a behavior that almost every human being on the planet engages in, usually without thinking about it.
You mean why we all instinctively morph our voices into high-pitched musical cartoon characters when we hold a baby?
Exactly. Linguists and anthropologists began systematically studying this phenomenon in the early 1960s. They documented a universal, cross-cultural speaking style directed specifically at infants.
It was originally termed motherese, but is now more accurately called parentese, or infant-directed speech, because fathers, non-parents, and even older siblings naturally slip into it.
It's a fundamental shift in the acoustic structure of how we talk.
The modifications are measurable and drastic. When an adult shifts into parentese, the baseline pitch of their voice jumps up by about an octave. The tempo of their speech slows down significantly. And the intonation contours, the melodic rise and fall of the sentence, are wildly exaggerated.
It feels like an emotional instinct. We think we are just being comforting or trying to elicit a smile, but neurologically, we are doing something deeply functional. We're actively optimizing the data for the baby's statistical engine.
We are essentially providing high-definition acoustic training data. In parentheses, the phonetic units are spoken much more clearly and are acoustically stretched.
Remember the Formant frequencies we discussed earlier?
Yes. When parents use infant-directed speech, they unconsciously exaggerate the acoustic distinctiveness of the vowels and consonants. They stretch the acoustic space between the formants, making the categories further apart and easier for the infant's brain to map.
We're drawing the boundaries with a thick black marker instead of a pencil, and we tailor that marker to our specific language, don't we?
We do. Adults unconsciously exaggerate the exact phonetic features that are most critical to their native language's specific rulebook. For instance, in Mandarin Chinese, pitch changes, the 4 distinct tones, are phonemic. They change the dictionary meaning of the word.
And studies show that Chinese mothers speaking parentese to their infants will heavily exaggerate those specific tones, stretching them out much further than they would in adult-directed speech.
And the babies crave this optimized data. If you put an infant in a room where turning their head to the left triggers a recording of flat, adult-directed speech, and turning their head to the right triggers exaggerated parentese, they will consistently turn to activate the parentese. Their brain knows it is the better learning material.
And this is not a trivial preference. The source points out that the quality and quantity of infant-directed speech in the home environment has profound long-term neurological consequences.
Right. A lack of high-quality, exaggerated linguistic input during this early window strongly correlates with decreased functional activation and language-specific brain areas later in life, and is a significant predictor of literacy and reading deficits by school age.
Which perfectly underscores a somewhat tragic biological reality. The window of optimal learning doesn't stay open forever. This is the concept of the critical period, heavily championed by Eric Lenneberg in the late 1960s.
Yes. Lenneberg proposed that maturational biological factors in the brain naturally alter the neural mechanisms available for language acquisition over time. Specifically, he argued that passing through puberty fundamentally changes brain plasticity.
It explains the incredibly frustrating phenomenon where a young child can move to a new country and effortlessly absorb the new language with a native accent in a year, while their parents, who possess vastly superior general cognitive skills, logic, and study habits, struggle for decades and retain a heavy accent.
Classic sociological and cognitive studies validate this. Researchers examined cohorts of Chinese and Korean immigrants who had relocated to the United States. They were given rigorous tests requiring them to identify subtle grammatical errors in complex English sentences.
And the results showed a strict, linear decline in performance based precisely on the age they arrived in the U.S.
The older they were when the second language exposure began, the poorer their ultimate grammatical mastery, regardless of how many decades they subsequently lived in an English-speaking environment.
And crucially, this isn't just about the mechanics of the vocal cords or hearing. The critical period applies to the structural architecture of language itself, regardless of the modality. They prove this by looking at the deaf community.
Yes, studies on American Sign Language acquisition provided the definitive proof that the critical period is about brain structure, not just acoustic hearing. Researchers tested deaf individuals who all used ASL fluently in their daily lives, but who had been exposed to it at different ages.
Because some deaf children are born to deaf parents and get ASL from birth, while others are born to hearing parents and might not be exposed to a formal sign language until school age.
Exactly. When tested on the deep, complex morphological and syntactic rules of ASL, the individuals exposed from birth performed the best. Those whose exposure began around age 5 performed slightly worse.
And those who weren't exposed until after age 12 performed substantially poorer on the formal grammatical structures, despite having used ASL constantly for decades since. The biological window for building the foundational architecture closes, and any later learning has to rely on different, more effortful cognitive pathways.
Which brings us to a major transition point.
Okay, so we have traversed a massive amount of territory. We've established the structural complexity of phonemes, morphemes, and syntax. We have explored the developmental timeline from the in utero prosody and the 6-month-old universalist through the statistical and social gating mechanisms to the closing of the critical period.
The inevitable next question, which brings us to the third major phase of our exploration, is what does the finished product look like? Once the brain has spent childhood building this language network, how does the mature adult brain physically process a sentence?
To understand the modern, cutting-edge view of the language brain, we have to recognize what it replaced. For decades, essentially the entire 20th century, neurology relied on the classic Wernicke model. It was the standard textbook diagram.
Formulated primarily from autopsies and lesion studies in the 19th and mid-20th centuries. And because of the technological limitations of the time, the Wernicke model proposed a very linear, localized, and somewhat simplistic circuit.
It essentially argued that acoustic sound signals arrived at the auditory cortex, were relayed to a single region in the temporal lobe called Wernicke's area to extract the meaning of the words, and then that meaning was shuttled down a single unidirectional white matter highway called the arcuate fasciculus to the frontal lobe, to Broca's area, which organized the motor commands for the mouth to speak.
It was essentially a biological telephone line. A to B to C, sensory input to dictionary to motor output. But as with most things in neuroscience, the reality is exponentially more complex. The old model was blown out of the water by the advent of advanced structural brain imaging.
The technological leap changed everything. We are talking about techniques like diffusion tensor imaging, tractography, and quantitative MRI.
Let's actually explain those, because they sound like buzzwords, but the physics of how they work is what allows us to see the wiring. How does DTI reveal a neural network in a living person?
Well, diffusion tensor imaging tracks the microscopic movement of water molecules inside the brain. In the fluid spaces of the brain, water moves randomly in all directions. But inside the white matter, the massive bundles of axon cables connecting different brain regions, the water molecules are forced to diffuse linearly, traveling parallel to the axon fibers, much like cars restricted to moving along the lanes of a highway.
So by using the MRI to track which direction the water is flowing, the computer can essentially trace the 3D highways of the brain in real time.
Exactly. Tractography takes that directional water data and renders it into a vivid 3D map of the brain's dense, interconnected fiber tracks. For the first time, neuroscientists could trace the precise, incredibly complex white matter connections in healthy living subjects, rather than relying on damaged postmortem tissue.
And what those 3D maps revealed led to the modern cutting-edge framework, the dual-stream model of language processing, heavily elaborated by researchers like Hickok, People, and Frederici.
And the easiest way to visualize this language model is to borrow an analogy from the visual system. We have a what stream and a where stream for our eyes. How does that dual-stream architecture apply to our ears and language?
The architecture is wonderfully parallel. Let's trace the signal. The starting point for both streams is the same. The raw acoustic sound waves hit the bilateral auditory cortex, meaning it happens in both the left and right hemispheres.
The brain does an initial spectrotemporal analysis, mapping the raw frequencies. Then the signal moves slightly outward to the posterior superior temporal gyrus for phonological analysis, identifying the specific phones.
But here, at this temporal junction, the processing splits, diverging into two massive, simultaneous, independent computational streams.
Let's crack the first one, the dorsal stream. Where does it go and what does it do?
The dorsal stream is the sensoromotor stream. It arches upward and forward, passing above the lateral ventricles. Its specific job is to map auditory sound to motor articulation. It takes the acoustic signal and asks, how do I physically move my mouth to recreate this sound?
It translates sensory input into a motor plan. It is the how pathway. Like a piano player looking at sheet music, not to hear the song, but to know exactly where to place their fingers. And the anatomy of this stream is heavily lateralized, isn't it?
Highly lateralized. The dorsal stream is strongly dominant in the left hemisphere for the vast majority of people. And modern tractography shows it isn't just one wire. It actually splits into distinct sub-pathways.
One branch, dorsal 1, connects to the premotor cortex. Another branch, dorsal 2, connects the temporal lobe to the posterior inferior frontal cortex, which includes Broca's area.
So it's feeding the acoustic target directly to the motor planning areas. That is a dorsal stream. Sound to action. Now, what about the other massive branch that split off?
That is the ventral stream. This is the sensory conceptual stream. It sweeps downward and forward through the temporal lobe. Its job is to map the acoustic sound to actual meaning. It is the what pathway.
It acts as the brain's dictionary and conceptual synthesizer. It asks, what does this acoustic signal signify about the world?
And structurally, how does it differ from the heavily left-sided dorsal stream?
The ventral stream is much more bilateral. It operates robustly in both the left and right hemispheres. It extends deep into the anterior temporal lobe and the middle temporal gyrus, which are critical hubs for semantic memory and conceptual knowledge, before looping back up to the anterior inferior frontal cortex to aid in syntactic processing.
So to summarize the dual stream map, the ventral stream accesses the dictionary definition of the word, while the dorsal stream retrieved the motor sequence required to say it out loud. Now, tying this back to our timeline of babies learning language, are these dual streams active in those 7-month-old universalist infants we discussed earlier? Or is this massive dual highway system something that only gets built after they learn to speak?
This is where developmental neuroscience provides a stunning revelation. Researchers used functional MEG imaging magnetoencephalography, which measures the magnetic fields produced by neural electrical activity, to look at the brains of 7-month-old infants while they simply listen to speech syllables.
They aren't talking. They're just sitting there listening to a speaker play sounds. What lit up?
Not only did their superior temporal auditory regions light up, which you would expect from hearing a sound, but the MEG detected synchronized activation in the inferior frontal regions and the cerebellum. Those are motor planning areas.
At 7 months old, months before they will utter their first intentional word, the act of merely hearing speech forces the infant brain to rehearse the motor plans required to produce it. The dorsal stream is already actively forging the sensor-motor link.
The brain is running internal invisible rehearsals of speech production just by listening. But we established that at 12 months, the baby undergoes that massive pruning phase. They lock into their native sounds and lose the phonetic boundaries for foreign sounds.
How does that shift manifest in the dual-stream brain scans? This is referred to as the 12-month paradox, right?
Yeah. Yes. The paradox highlights the struggle of the brain trying to process data without a motor map. At 12 months, when you play a baby sounds from their native language, their auditory areas light up strongly and efficiently. They have specialized their sensory network.
But when you play non-native foreign sounds for a 12-month-old, you actually see an explosion of diffuse, prolonged activation in the motor areas, Broca's area and the cerebellum.
Which feels entirely backward. Why would foreign sounds, which they don't understand and can't produce, trigger more motor activity than their native language?
Because the brain is failing, and it is failing loudly. By 12 months, the infant has successfully linked the stored auditory patterns of their native language to the specific motor plans needed to replicate them. It is an efficient, tightly bound circuit.
But when they hear a foreign sound, say, a Japanese baby hearing the English R, they possess no sensor-motor association for it. The brain realizes it doesn't have the motor sequence to match the acoustic target.
Consequently, it works overtime, firing diffusely across the motor cortex, frantically trying to generate a physical plan for an alien sound it hasn't mapped. It is the neural equivalent of a computer fan spinning up to maximum speed because the processor is choking on an unrecognized file format.
The dual streams are desperately trying to sync up. Now, we've noted that the dorsal stream, the action pathway, is heavily left hemisphere dominant. For decades, pop psychology has told us that language is exclusively a left brain function. What is the right hemisphere doing during all of this? Is it just passively along for the ride?
Not at all. The right hemisphere is doing vital, complex computational work, primarily centered around prosody, while the left hemisphere is obsessively crunching the phonemes, morphemes, and strict syntactic grammar. The right hemisphere is processing the emotional and paralinguistic prosody of the speech.
Paralinguistic meaning the context around the words, rather than the dictionary definition of the words themselves.
Exactly. The right hemisphere tracks the slow, low-frequency pitch contours. It decodes the speaker's mood, their intentions, whether they're being sarcastic, angry, or comforting. It's a brilliant division of labor.
We see this clinically. Patients with right hemisphere lesions often speak with completely flat robotic affect or with totally inappropriate emotional stress, and they severely struggle to interpret the emotional tone in other people's voices, even though they understand the strict grammar of the sentences perfectly.
But the processing of pitch isn't always delegated to the right hemisphere, is it? Because as we mentioned earlier with Mandarin Chinese parentese, pitch can be linguistic. Tone can change the actual dictionary definition of the word. A rising pitch might mean mother, while a falling pitch might mean horse. How does the brain divide that labor?
This specific question highlights the incredible selectivity of the brain's routing system. A brilliant fMRI study demonstrated a double dissociation regarding pitch. When native Mandarin and Thai speakers listened to syllables carrying their native linguistic tones, it was not the right hemisphere that lit up. Instead, the left planum temporal, a key structure in the left auditory network, activated strongly.
The routing depends entirely on the function of the data. If the pitch fluctuation acts as vocabulary or grammar, the brain routes it to the left hemisphere. If the exact same acoustic pitch fluctuation acts as an emotional signal, it routes it to the right hemisphere. The brain is sorting the acoustic waterfall by abstract purpose in real time.
It is a dynamic, highly distributed network. The dual streams, the bilateral routing, it is a masterpiece of biological engineering.
Okay, so we have this stunning architectural map. The dorsal how pathway driving action, the ventral what pathway mapping, meaning the parallel right hemisphere processing emotion. But in an advanced neuroscience context, we cannot just accept a theoretical blueprint based on healthy fMRI scans.
Right. The ultimate test of any neuroanatomical model is pathology. We learn exactly what a brain region does by observing the specific heartbreaking deficits that arise when that exact region is destroyed.
And this brings us to the final phase of our deep dive, validating the dual-stream brain map through the clinical study of aphasias. Aphasia is the general term for a loss of language ability following brain damage, most commonly from a stroke blocking blood flow to specific cortical areas.
For over a century, clinical neurology has relied on the lesion method, mapping the behavioral deficit to the location of the dead tissue. And what we find is that the classic aphasias map with astonishing precision onto the breakdowns of the modern dual-stream model.
Let's start with the most famous one, Broca's aphasia. It results from damage to the left inferior frontal gyrus, the insula, and the underlying white matter tracts.
Oh, yeah.
Looking at our map, this is essentially a catastrophic failure of the dorsal stream, the sensoromotor how pathway. What does this look like in a patient?
Because the dorsal stream maps sound to motor action, damage here breaks the ability to fluidly articulate speech. Patients with Broca's aphasia suffer from nonfluent, extremely labored, and halting speech. They lose melodic prosodic intonation. Every word requires immense physical and mental effort to produce.
They retain the ability to produce concrete nouns. They know what they want to say, but they severely lack verbs, and they drop the functional grammatical morphemes like the, is, and on. It is often called a telegraphic speech pattern.
But for a long time, neurology classified Broca's aphasia strictly as a motor production problem, assuming their comprehension of language was perfectly intact. But the modern view reveals a hidden, deep comprehension deficit related to syntax, doesn't it?
It does, and it proves that the frontal lobe isn't just a dumb motor output relay. It is deeply involved in assembling grammar. A Broca's patient can engage in basic conversation because they can rely on the ventral stream to give them the dictionary meaning of nouns, and they use general worldly logic to deduce the rest.
The source gives a perfect example to illustrate this logic bypass. If you say to a Broca's patient, "The apple that the girl ate was green," they will nod and understand you perfectly.
Because it is a non-reversible sentence. Their ventral stream identifies apple, girl, ate, and green. Using pure worldly logic, girls eat apples. Apples do not eat girls. They do not need complex syntax to deduce the meaning of the event.
But the illusion of perfect comprehension shatters if you change the grammatical reliance. If you give them a sentence like, "The girl that the boy is chasing is tall," what happens?
I completely lost. They cannot tell you who is tall or who is doing the chasing. Because both boys and girls can be tall, and a boy can chase a girl just as easily as a girl can chase a boy.
Yeah.
General worldly logic cannot solve the puzzle.
The only way to derive the meaning is to parse the strict, formal syntax of the sentence structure. Because their left inferior frontal lobe, a critical hub for syntactical processing, is damaged, their ability to decode that complex grammar is broken.
Now let's contrast that with the opposite pathology, Wernicke's aphasia. This results from damage to the posterior temporal lobe structures on the left side. Looking at the dual stream map, this is massive damage to the ventral stream, the what pathway of meaning and conceptual representation.
Wernicke's aphasia presents as the mirror opposite of Broca's. Because their dorsal motor stream is largely intact, their speech production is effortless, abundant, and retains all the normal melodic intonation and rhythm of natural speech. They sound fluent.
But because the ventral stream is damaged, the auditory input cannot access the mental dictionary, and their output cannot be linked to actual meaning.
So what comes out of their mouth is a fluent, highly articulate word salad. It is utterly incomprehensible, and their comprehension of what you say to them is profoundly impaired. Furthermore, because the semantic checking mechanisms are damaged, they produce what neurologists call paraphasias.
Let's define paraphasias because they reveal how the brain categorizes words. There are two main types described in the text.
The first is a phonemic paraphasia. This is where the patient fluently articulates a word, but they swap or substitute individual phonetic units, saying bife instead of knife.
The second, which is even more revealing about the ventral stream's semantic storage, is a semantic paraphasia. This is where the patient flawlessly articulates a real word, but it is the wrong word, typically belonging to the same conceptual category as the intended word.
For example, they might look at a picture of the president and call him the head man, or look at a dog and confidently call it a cat. The conceptual category is activated, but the specific node is lost.
And perhaps the most tragic aspect of Wernicke's aphasia is anosognosia. Because their auditory comprehension is broken, many patients have no idea that they aren't making sense. They hear themselves speaking fluently and become frustrated when others don't understand them.
Okay, so Broca's is broken articulation but preserved basic meaning. Wernicke's is broken meaning but preserved articulation. What happens if we look at the white matter highways connecting these cortical islands?
This introduces the concept of disconnection syndromes, specifically conduction aphasia. This is typically caused by damage to the sylvian parietal temporal area, which physically interrupts the white matter tracts of the dorsal stream, like severing a data cable.
But the cortical endpoints, the frontal motor planning areas and the temporal semantic areas, are relatively spared. What does a severed cable look like behaviorally?
In conduction aphasia, spontaneous self-generated speech is relatively okay, though they may make some phonemic errors. And their auditory comprehension of a conversation is largely intact. But if you ask them to repeat a specific sentence verbatim to act as a direct echo, they fail dramatically.
Because the strict direct sensoromotor interface linking the exact auditory representation of a word to the exact motor action required to reproduce it has been physically disconnected. The raw acoustic data cannot reach the motor planner.
Okay, I want to pose a hypothetical architectural puzzle here. We know damage to the connecting white matter causes conduction aphasia, meaning they can speak and understand but cannot repeat. What happens if we reverse the damage pattern? What if the connecting fibers of the arcuate fasciculus and the core language loop are completely spared, but the surrounding association cortex, the perimeter, is severely damaged?
You have just perfectly deduced the anatomical basis of the transcortical aphasias. They are the exact behavioral and anatomical complement to conduction aphasia. Because the core parasylvian language loop Broca's, Wernicke's, and the connecting tracts is perfectly intact, these patients possess a remarkable ability. They can repeat long, complex sentences flawlessly. The core echo mechanism survives.
But because the surrounding cortex is dead, the loop is isolated from the rest of the brain's functions.
Exactly. The loop is cut off from the systems that initiate thought or store deep semantic knowledge. There are two primary variations. The first is transcortical motor aphasia, caused by damage to the left dorsolateral frontal area, which handles executive control and the initiation of action.
The patient can perfectly repeat a sentence you say to them, but they cannot initiate spontaneous speech on their own. They are nonfluent because the go signal from the executive frontal lobe can't reach the intact language loop.
And the second variation is transcortical sensory aphasia. This results from damage to the junction of the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. This area acts as a critical hub connecting the language loop to the broader semantic networks scattered across the cortex.
In transcortical sensory aphasia, the patient can echo your complex sentences flawlessly, demonstrating fluent articulation, but because the loop is severed from the semantic dictionary, they have absolutely no idea what the words they are repeating actually mean. It is an empty echo.
And finally, at the most devastating end of the clinical spectrum, there is global aphasia. Global aphasia results from massive catastrophic strokes, usually involving the entire middle cerebral artery territory. It causes widespread destruction of the frontal, temporal, and parietal parasylvian language centers, the basal ganglia, and the insula.
In global aphasia, almost all functional language capability is wiped out. Auditory comprehension is gone, fluent speech production is gone. The entire dual stream network has collapsed.
It is a devastating reality for the patient. But the source material notes that even in global aphasia, some tiny fragments of vocalization can remain. What survives the collapse?
The only things that typically remain are deeply ingrained, automatic speech patterns. The patient might be able to recite a highly overlearned sequence like counting from 1 to 10 or reciting the days of the week. They might be able to sing the lyrics to a familiar song if prompted with the melody.
And very often, they retain the ability to utter stock expletives. These highly automatic, emotionally charged, or musical outputs are likely relying on heavily preserved pathways in the right hemisphere or subcortical basal ganglia circuits, completely bypassing the destroyed syntactical machinery of the left hemisphere.
It is a sobering, profound reminder of how fragile, yet incredibly resilient and intricately partitioned this network is. We have been on an epic journey today through the landscape of human cognition. We started by looking at the microscopic physics of formant frequencies and the genetic rules of phonotactics.
We watched a 6-month-old universalist infant acting as a tiny, brilliant statistician using social gaze and human connection to lock onto transitional probabilities and build an internal dictionary. We mapped how the mature adult brain processes this data in real time, routing the what to the ventral stream, the how to the dorsal stream, and the emotion to the right hemisphere.
And we saw how the tragic reality of stroke lesions brutally validates its complex, invisible blueprint. The sheer computational heavy lifting happening in your head right at this very second, just so you can comprehend the words I am speaking, represents the highest, most staggering achievement of biological evolution.
It truly is a marvel. But before we conclude, I want to introduce one final mind-bending detail from the source material. It is an implication that completely reframes everything we've just discussed about evolution. Remember back in Section 2, when we discussed Keter Imus and his habituation dial, how he proved that human infants possess categorical perception for phonemes?
Right. The dial slowly turning from ba to pa, and the human brain forcing that smooth acoustic transition into a rigid, sharp phonetic boundary. The ultimate human superpower that allows language to exist.
Well, 4 years after Imus published that study in 1975, a group of scientists decided to run that exact same mathematical acoustic test on non-human mammals. They used chinchillas, and later studies used macaque monkeys. They trained the animals to respond to different sounds and mapped their auditory boundaries.
Then what did they find?
What they discovered shook the foundations of linguistics. The chinchillas and the monkeys also demonstrated categorical perception of human phonemes.
Wait. You're saying a chinchilla hears the exact same sharp boundary between ba and pa that a human adult does?
Precisely the same boundary. The acoustic sensitivities match almost perfectly. And this suggests a staggering evolutionary twist. For decades, we assumed that when human language evolved, it forced the hominid brain to develop entirely new, magical, highly specialized auditory rules to handle the complexity of speech. We thought we invented phonemes.
But the chinchilla data flips that completely backward.
It does. It implies that human language naturally adapted itself to capitalize on the pre-existing physical structures, sensitivities, and limitations of the mammalian ear. We didn't invent phonetic boundaries out of thin air to suit our massive frontal lobes.
We built our greatest cognitive achievement, our infinite capacity for poetry and mathematics and conversation, entirely within the restrictive acoustic boundaries we inherited from our ancient, non-speaking mammalian ancestors.
We are essentially speaking a complex code that was optimized millions of years ago to be perfectly caught by a chinchilla's ear.
That is absolutely incredible. The ultimate engineering marvel, the absolute pinnacle of human intellect and social connection, built entirely on top of ancient borrowed hardware. That is something to profoundly ponder the next time you find yourself frustrated with your smart speaker's lack of comprehension, or the next time you find yourself talking in an exaggerated, high-pitched voice to a 3-year-old child.